Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Alex Hoerr. I own and run Optimum Joy Clinical Counseling in Chicago, and I'm honestly super excited. Shalom Parker is here with me, and we're going to kind of get into more about who she is and like her love of art and expression. Honestly, we were just kind of talking offline that I think we probably know at least like 50 to 100 of the same people. It's probably a little bit of exaggeration, but I don't think so. But this is like the first time we're talking. So I'm glad to meet you. I think I'm going to be learning about you just kind of alongside everybody else. But I think just to start, let me just kind of say how I came to follow you on Instagram and was seeing kind of some of the cool stuff you did, which is why we have you on here. Is I actually live in Pilsen, right around the corner. I think I was telling you, and just like following Healthy Hood and all the cool things that they're doing. And when they started the We Got Us, the mental health campaign, and I started seeing you on Instagram doing like these nice live things or just like talking about mental health. And I was like, oh my gosh, there is like some good things being done like right around the corner from my house. So that's how we kind of got connected. Just I think in a crazy time with like Black Lives Matter, with COVID, all this different stuff. We at Optimum Joy are just trying to like have more conversations around mental health and emotional wellness. And I think that you have something really like beautiful and unique to offer to the conversation. So I'm just like excited to kind of get into it with you. But let's, can you just tell us kind of more about yourself, where you hail from, if you're originally from Chicago, some of like those just like personal things about who you are.
Yeah. So I'm actually not from Chicago originally. I grew up in Nebraska. I moved here to the Chicago area for undergrad, and I've been here for 10 years now, so I like to claim it, but I technically know that I can't because I didn't grow up here. So I actually, in undergrad, I majored in studio art, and so I've always loved art and artistic expression and things like that. And my first year out of college, I taught ceramics at a school on the South Side, actually. And that was like my first love of like social justice and art mixed together and trying to figure out what that all looks like and how that is going to play in my career. And then I've done a couple different jobs since then. I'm currently working at Breakthrough on the West Side, and I run their arts and technology program, which I really love doing. I've been there for 3 years, but I did discover that I like older kids. And so I've been doing girls mentoring with them, which has been really great and things like that. But I am currently in grad school for art therapy and counseling. And so what I hope to do is start a nonprofit working with youth coming out of the criminal justice system and merge the art and the mental health and counseling together.
Oh, I love that, honestly. And in Nebraska, were you from like an urban or a rural area?
I'm from Lincoln, which is the capital city.
Okay, so kind of more urban for Nebraska, maybe.
Yes. But so in the process of like doing all of this research for COVID and like all of the things that were happening, I was having a conversation with my dad about how we like had one of the counties with the most cases for a little while or something. And we did the math, and the entire state of Nebraska has the third amount of people that is in Cook County. So like, there's no comparison.
That's almost like math I can't quite wrap my head around because it's too different, honestly. That's crazy. Mm-hmm. I was curious because I grew up on a farm in Missouri, so I was hoping to bond with you over some like ruralness, but I'll just like take that to myself over here. But 10 years in Chicago, that's actually a long time to like get to know the community and like hearing just that you've done so many different things. I feel like, I don't know if this is your experience, but like 7 years and 10 years, isn't that kind of like when people move away from Chicago? So I don't know if you're thinking about moving or not. We don't, like, maybe that's something you don't want to talk about.
No, not at all.
You're going to make it past the 10-year itch for Chicago. I love that. So, I'm curious, like, has art always been a part of you, or was it something you almost like came into in your life?
Yeah, I remember it from a very early age. My Nebraska experience was like doing the county fair, and like within the county fair, my mom would always be like wanting us to grow vegetables and like can things and bake bread, and I was like, no, I want to do the art stuff. And like I had like a whole series of years that I was making these like pictures out of clay, and like putting them on like mat board, and I won like first place like 3 years in a row. Which is interesting because now I'm a ceramic artist. So yeah, so it's kind of always been there, and I've always like thought creatively. But actually, I didn't go into undergrad being an art major. I thought I was going to be elementary education, because I just didn't really think that art was something that was sustainable and that I would be able to find a career. And my freshman year, I got done with the year and I was like, I don't think my parents are going to support me switching. I don't really know what I'm going to do. And then my dad like brought it up. He was like, have you thought about being an art major? And that was like all of the confirmation that I needed. And then I went with it. And it's been really cool because honestly, every job that I've had in the last 5 years, I've been able to use ceramics in some way, shape, or form. So
that's amazing. And honestly, like, way to go, sweet dad, because I feel like, I don't know if you have read a lot of like Brene Brown stuff, but I'm pretty sure it's in her book that in middle school, that's when people start to get like negative messages that land as like shame messages at our core. And she was saying that especially around like creativity in the arts, is that's when people are like, it's like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like that age is when people start to almost kind of let our culture shape like the devaluing of art. And I think to almost hear your dad enter into that, I'm like, that's a really sweet thing that I'm like, I feel a sweetness towards him. I don't even know the man. So
I was learning about it. We were talking about the stages of development in art in class, like last year, I think it was. And all of the stages up until I think 7 or 8, like everyone is pretty comparable, but once you hit 8, it's like the people who are artistically minded are still putting in the effort in order to continue to develop and grow their skills. But then that is also the point when we're susceptible to comparison and being like, oh, I'm just not good at this. And so it's like, if you are actually still trying, then you will develop along this path. And if you stop, then you'll go on a whole nother path and not really develop much more from that point.
I didn't realize that. So really just kind of, even from like a parents raising kids perspective, or like teachers who are engaging, or like even like Sunday school teachers, I think sometimes like anybody, coaches, all that different stuff. That's a really tender age, I guess, to say. So you said that you actually like working with older kids?
Yes. So teaching high school was like my sweet spot. Like I loved all of that. And so working at Breakthrough was my first time of like a full-time job with like school age kids, and I really love them and it's great. And it works really well because I usually have like one class like once a week for like 2 hours with each different group of kids. And so it's like, okay, that's manageable. But if I was doing this like a full-time teacher or like an after-school teacher, I don't know if I could do it. I respect it a lot.
I worked as a registered play therapist with 2 to 12-year-olds for not quite 2 years at a place out in Hinsdale, like a wonderful practice. And I think that honestly, like I was resonating with a lot you were telling me before about like appreciating art as an expression and like interweaving that into mental health, because I think through my work with 2 to 12-year-olds, I started to realize that like language is super powerful, but it's not everything. And sometimes like when it comes to our mental and emotional health, there's things that like are happening inside of us that a word can't quite encapsulate. Whereas like a song or like a picture or just something that has more, I don't know, like color and image and texture, all that different stuff actually like translates to emotion.
Yeah.
And like for kids, I think it's like 10 or 11 that's when words start to solidify into meaning. So if they obviously need it in the context of my job, but I feel like it's the same thing is still happening for adults.
Yep.
In their work. So I don't know if you have anything to say.
Yeah, within my own personal experience, like before I even started studying art therapy, like that's 100% how it worked. My first, like I said, I taught school on the South Side, and within a month and a half of me working there, one of my students was shot and killed. And it was just like heartbreaking, and I was like 21, 22, trying to figure out like how to process it myself, how to be there for my students, and how to like talk to people who were like completely outside of this world that I was in about it. And I wrote a poem, I did a couple of art projects, and like the process of doing that was like so healing to me, but it also gave me the words to explain what was going on to other people. And so it was like kind of like a translation for me.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's really beautiful. And I'm so sorry for that experience. Um, you know, even just kind of thinking about that isn't, unfortunately not a really uncommon experience. And again, just kind of like the context of like Black Lives Matter, what we saw with George Floyd, what isn't like a new problem, but there's a lot of engagement around it. Just with some of the work you're doing in communities, what are you noticing as it relates to mental and emotional health? And even like, I don't know if you would have any thoughts of how we could like continue to like even utilize art and expression, I think to meet that space where like change needs to happen, but also like lament and healing and like challenging and all these different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I have a million thoughts. Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like that for me has been a lot of the weight of the last couple of weeks is knowing that my community on the West Side and like all over, but like Black and Brown communities all over the city, all over the country are feeling the weight of COVID, are feeling the weight of gun violence for us at least. Within last weekend, we had the highest rate of deaths that we've had since we've been tracking it. So in 60 years in Chicago, we have never had that many deaths in one day. So like that's all happening within that, as well as the vicarious trauma through all of that's happening with the Black Lives Matter movement and like the video of George Floyd going around. Like there's so much trauma and there's so much stress that's going to affect mental health if it hasn't already. And so I think it's really like we live in a really cool time in which like a lot of words like trauma informed and mental health and counseling are beginning to become like everyday conversation points, and people like the stigma is going down, and that is so important. But it's still not that accessible. And so within our community, like Breakthrough has so many things that we offer, but like that's been one of the last things that we've incorporated. And we have a whole youth center and we don't have a counselor yet for them.
Oh man.
Right. Which like hurts my heart.
Oh no, we gotta fix that, Shalom.
Right. So we're working on it, trying to build a position, get funding for it and things like that.
Yeah.
But like there's mental health is always going to be a problem in those communities because just the trauma that's experienced. So one of the things that I've learned throughout my time getting acquainted to the term trauma and figuring out what that actually looks like played out is that there's timeline and then timeless trauma. And so timeline is like something that you can point to a date, like it happened on this date. So on this day, I witnessed a shooting. On this day, whatever happened with a family member or anything like that, you can point it out. But then timeless trauma is basically it's like the things that are true of you that can be traumatizing. So this can be being a minority, being a woman. It could be physical things like being overweight, having no teeth, things like that, where the ways that people interact with you become traumatizing. And so, especially in our youth, like they have so many timeless and so many timeline, and sometimes it's being enacted by some of their trauma is being enacted by people who are supposed to be the loving, supporting parents or any kind of role like that. And then it becomes even more complex trauma. And so I feel like it's heartbreaking to think about. And it's really overwhelming to think about it in those terms. But for me, that was part of the reason why I got hooked up with Healthy Hood, and was like, that was for me the first time that I heard of like an accessible, free, like for the community, by the community. And so I really wanted to support that. And then within the videos I started doing from them, it was like, okay, if it's already inaccessible to do it, like to get into therapy when everything is ideal and like there is no coronavirus and shelter in place,
right?
How much harder is that now? So what can we do to give access to people something that they can do to self-soothe, to process things, to begin to start the process without having access to an actual counselor?
Right. Yeah. And have you noticed that like people are like engaging with that material and like resonating with it?
Yeah, I've had a good amount of people who've reached out and been like, I've been watching them, they've been super helpful, I've done this directive and this helped me with that. So yeah, I've really enjoyed the process. And
Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say it's been really cool to like meet new people, like including you through it.
Yeah, no, I bet. I really have like watched some of them. And I think I'm really proud of like our industry and how far we've come around like exactly what you're saying. Like mental health stigma is not the same as what it used to be, but even, so you're in like a nonprofit ministry context, and like Optimum Joy being like a private practice is two totally different sectors, but we're always asking like at Optimum Joy, how can we make it more accessible? And like, that's where we've like taken on interns and trainees and stuff like that. But it's just like I think doing things like this, doing things like your videos, so that more people almost feel I think that people want to be well.
Yeah.
Like deep down inside them, they all want to be well. So the more that they can kind of experience what that can be like, I just think that that's a powerful thing.
I agree 100%.
I'm really also resonating. I've never heard someone put timeless and timeline as like words around trauma. But I almost think like the timeless one is almost kind of like, I think the image that comes to mind is like a river or something that just like erodes the side of the like the riverbed and stuff like that, and all of a sudden like etches out. And it's not something that like happens like instantly, like the timeline you're talking about. It's more kind of like it just rubs away over time and like lands as like this really complicated stacked trauma that then it just like takes a lot to engage with it and heal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually just did a presentation on Monday for one of my classes.
Yeah.
And we were talking about race-based trauma and the different ways that just shows up in your life. And so I was coming up with like an art directive that would be helpful for it. And so we've been talking about early recollections and how some therapists use that to help you understand like where you are now and like what your views on life happen from the things that you first remember. And so I was processing that, but regarding race, like when is the first time that I remember being racialized, or the first time that I remember experiencing like microaggressions because of my race, and realizing how much that actually ties into like my views on race and like the ways that I interact with it and the things that I still currently feel is super interesting. And a lot of things like they happen so early, and like I have memories of like things that would happen with my cousins and with my sister that they do not remember at all, but they're like burned into my memory and I like remember it vividly. And so just realizing like the power of words and how much we don't necessarily realize the things that are being said to us or about us are going to impact us possibly for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, we were a couple of friends were over here last night for dinner, and just like we were catching up after being isolated, like in separate places for so long. And I was telling them a story where I said something to my niece recently that was like not my most patient, good self. I honestly was kind of like, oh girl, like you're getting on my last nerve. And they started joking around. They're like, oh my gosh, she's going to be 25 years old in therapy being like, I just can't do enough. And I try, and all this different stuff. But and we were kind of joking about it, but it actually, I was thinking about it earlier today because it's actually, first of all, I was feeling guilty as an aunt, but I think that it's just like like a picture of moments that to us sometimes like don't seem significant at all, but could land as like a perception about who I just am as a human being and how I engage in the world.
Yeah.
How old were you, would you say, when like race and like being like racially profiled, all that, like how old were you when you remember one of those like experiences?
So I'm not 100% sure on my ages. I'm horrible at remembering things in my childhood, which is why it's really interesting that I remember these things. So I actually did a whole like little Facebook post about it today, actually, because I've been thinking about it a lot in my own life. And so one of the ones that I specifically remember is I was with my mom's side of the family. So I'm mixed, half white and half black. My mom is white and my dad is black. But we grew up in Nebraska mostly around my mom's family. And so we were swimming in a lake and we were messing around like kids do with all of my cousins. And we were diving to the bottom to grab like handfuls of mud.
Yeah.
And at one point we like came up and one of my, I think it was like my second cousin, like looked at me and she goes, "What'd you do? Smear mud all over your face?" And like, that was like, oh, I'm different than you. Like you just put this together. I'm putting this together. I'm not really sure what happens, but my guess is I was probably like 7 or 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember where you like felt that? Like, was it just kind of like, oh, I felt numb in that moment. I felt like I wanted to cry. I felt angry. I guess that's kind of a personal question, but I'm curious, like, if you can even remember how that like landed in your body. Like
Yeah.
a 7 or 8-year-old that has like their cousin say, what's wrong with you, essentially.
I think at that point it was mostly confusion. But I remember a couple of years later, so every Christmas we always got together with all of our cousins and we would make Christmas cookies. And so there's like 13 of us, so we make like 20 different kinds of Christmas cookies and candies. And I usually really enjoyed it. And then this one Christmas, I like got really sad and I like ran into the bedroom and was like hiding underneath my grandma's bed crying. And my sister came and found me and was like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you crying? And I was like, I've never seen my cousins with anyone else who looked like us. I don't think that they would be our friends if we weren't related. And like, I think that was more like, as I processed it, I started to realize like, okay, there's a difference. And what does that mean for the difference in how you relate with me and who else you're around? So I think it took a little while for it to really hit in, but it clearly did set in at some point.
Yeah. You know, earlier I was just thinking about, because a lot of, you know, like, I feel like I'm always growing in my like work around minorities and power and like being a woman and all these different things. So most of my time, in probably like a fairly selfish way, has been spent thinking about being a woman, and especially like in a kind of male world. And I was reading an article about how like affinity bias, which is essentially like we gravitate towards those who are like us. And I was just thinking, I think reflecting on like all of our race issues and even like my partner and stuff like that, but it's like that was at play even like with you and your cousins, and I think is still at play now. Even just, and I'm not saying it's like necessarily a good or a bad thing, but I don't think it helps us understand one another when we actually move to these pocketed segments. But I feel like white people got to do a lot of work before we start. We got to carry some of that load, honestly. So for the sake of you guys not being exposed to our stupidity, I think that maybe we're going to work the affinity bias and just have white people work on some of that stuff before we send them back out there. But I'm just rambling now about affinity bias. But I was just thinking about how even just like certain protests and marches I've been on in the city is like mostly white people or mostly Black and brown people or mostly this. So it's even interesting to see us engage collectively on an issue from a source of like, what am I and who is like me? Because that's what makes me comfortable. Yeah.
I agree. It's very interesting to watch.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, we could talk all day about that, I bet.
Right?
Yeah. So, when it comes to, I mean, I'm really curious even about your like interest in the criminal justice system and how I think within that system you really kind of like hope to see like mental wellness and healing play out. And I've had pretty limited some exposure, but like pretty limited exposure to like what programs and stuff are offered within the criminal justice system. But what's kind of your hope maybe for engaging that community? And
yeah, so my first real like introduction to it was while I was teaching. I had a number of kids who were interacting with it in different stages. One of the most powerful ones for me was there was one of my students just wasn't in class for 2 weeks. And I started to hear from other kids that like he was in jail, didn't really know what was going on. And so then like 2 weeks later, he came back and we were sitting and talking. We were working, it was right around Christmas time. So I was helping them make ornaments for the tree. So it was like really simple, like you just flatten it out, cut out the little star, cut out the Christmas tree or whatever. And so while we were like working, I just sat and like talked to him and was like, oh, this is like the little update of how you do this, blah, blah, blah. So he was like sitting and working with it the whole time that he was talking to me. And he was telling me about how he was like riding with a friend in a car, and apparently there was like a warrant out for the car. I think it might have been stolen. I can't remember all of the details. But he didn't know anything about it. He was just with his friend who was driving. Right. And so then all of a sudden they get in a car chase with the cops, and his friend like literally crashes the car. He like bails out of the car, crashes it. So he's in a car accident and then gets arrested because he was in this car that was stolen. And so he gets locked up for 2 weeks. And in the process, he's missing school. He lost his job. He like gets out finally. And so is like trying to figure out what to do. Like he had a number of like things that he had to do for parole and for all of those different things that like happened during school hours. Like he had like hearings that were happening during school hours. So all of this time he was like trying to do like right, but through the process, like the system was like not supporting him at all,
right.
And not giving him what he needed in order to succeed. So it was like this thing that wasn't his fault and wasn't his decision is now going to be impacting him for the next couple months. Right. Yeah. And so like that was super powerful. But then also like while he was telling me his story, he was working on this ornament and it like turned out really good. And he like looked at me and he goes, I never knew that I could make something like this. And like he like, I think he was older. So I want to say he was like 19 or 20. And he like had never really made something that he was proud of. And it literally felt like, you know, like when you hear about kindergartners like wanting their mom to put it up on the refrigerator, it was like that. It was like, I did this and I'm proud of it and I created it with my hands. And so like the power of that and like the fact that he was so willing to talk to me like while his hands were busy, like spurred a lot of thoughts in my head. Yeah, so I've had a lot of other instances working with kids and like hearing their stories and things like that. So my goal or my dream would be to actually start my own nonprofit / social enterprise, and then have a building where they can come and get art therapy services. And so then they would be working through their trauma, their emotional experiences, getting to a healthier place mentally. But at the same time, they would be getting trained in hopefully one of 3 mediums. So the 3 that I have in my head would be
I wondered, I wondered.
Screen printing, ceramics, and paper making.
Ooh, wow.
Yes.
Yes. I was not expecting you to say paper making, but I'm like, I'm there for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because number one, they are very marketable. Like if you can make good quality products, people will buy them. Like, yes.
My sister will buy them.
Yeah. I heard someone say that they were trying to buy like handmade paper and they found a book that had 4 pages in it for $1,000.
Oh my gosh.
I was like, I didn't know it was that marketable, but I knew it was marketable.
Oh my gosh, that just like talk about accessibility. Wow, that's a whole other demographic. Wow.
Right? But yeah, all 3 of those are like super tactile. So you can get into it, you can move, you can manipulate things. It's not like sitting and doing minute details with a pen or a paintbrush or whatever, but it's like I can be physical getting it out, and then it's marketable. And so then the goal would be that they can sell the work that they made. So having both an online platform that they can be in charge of and learn the marketing and business skills, but then also going to local craft fairs where they get more of the like personable, like face-to-face interactions, learning to communicate well, to learning how to sell better. And then these things are marketable whichever field they go from here on, where it's not like we're trying to build an army of artists, but giving you the soft skills that will make it marketable from there on, as well as teaching classes to the greater community and having them be the ones that are teaching it, and that like empowerment of being able to give back something that they've learned to other people.
Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful. I am like, I can't wait for it to be Shalom. It's going to be so beautiful. And you know, it's just reminding me, so I like grew up in the field in community mental health. And I was working in a jobs program for 17 to 24-year-olds. And I think, you know, part of me is just like even reflecting on you know, I'm sure like other people have so many different narratives for this, but even like the Christian narrative where work was like there before the fall, you
Yeah.
know, and I think that there's something about work that just like gives dignity because it's like, wow, there's something valuable about me. Like even for that 19-year-old kid to have made a paper ornament and be like, I can do something good. I
Mm-hmm.
just think that that's like really powerful. I'm so excited for you. I'm
Thanks.
so excited. When's it going to come to be?
So I'm assuming that because I would be offering art therapy
Yeah.
practices, it would have to be after I get the next step of licensure. So my hope is that after I graduate this summer, I'll work 2 years underneath somebody and then be able to starting it in the next like 3 to 5 years.
Oh, I am like very familiar with that timeline. Talk about, you know, I feel like I was just talking, so Pamela Larkin, she was on here for like our last interview, and we were talking about just offline about a lot of like her and I spent a good amount of time talking about how do we like continue to make sure that like more people of color are like coming into the field and all this different stuff. And she was just, her and I were reflecting on how I feel like grad school and the timeline where you have to work for free your entire second year of grad school, there's just like an absurd timeline that is inaccessible to certain demographics. Even like myself, who probably had so many more resources in different ways, like took out an astronomical amount of student loans in order to do that. And it's just kind of like, oh, that is like painful for the rest of life. But then it's just like, have even more stuff piled on top, and it's like, how is anybody really going to continue to be healers and helpers in the field when there's this stretched out timeline?
Yeah, I'm very passionate about that. I within my program,
Yeah.
in the cohort that I'm in, it's a social justice focused school. So that feels like it should be like, oh, we have so many people from so many walks of life and all,
Right.
and it's not. Like we have, I want to say like 50 to 60 people in each cohort, and within the second year cohort that I like is graduating now, but I've like spanned 3 of them because I'm technically part-time. I think there's 8 people of color who are graduating, and only 1 of them is Black, and there's no males. It's all females.
That's another, yeah, that's very true. But it's just like, that's a when you think about population breakdowns, that's just like, it's unequal representation. And there really just does, you know, all the time, I sometimes will run like the intakes at the counseling center, and all the time it's just kind of like gender, age, race, like culture you grew up in. There's all these different things that make up like a person that I think is actually like really important in, like, let's say someone like does therapy and counseling with somebody. It's like, wow, me meeting with a woman, or me meeting with maybe someone who is like different than me. Like I meet with a 69-year-old white man, and that has been a really almost like good for me experience to experience something different than myself. But it just really matters sometimes that like the person I'm meeting with looks like me, sounds like me, has the same experiences. And if there's just such a disparity, I don't know, it wrecks my heart.
Yeah, and I mean it's like really hard to say because I don't want to discourage people from seeking counseling, but there's also trauma that happens within the counseling room. And the amount of friends that I've had who have like had negative experiences, or even myself, like I went to counseling for couples counseling, and it was awful. And I think that if I hadn't been in school and I hadn't had time to process all of those things, I don't know if I would have known what to do with it, because I would have thought that that is how counseling is and is supposed to be, and not realize that this was like one bad counselor.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I think if you've had a bad experience wherever you are, I'm like, try it again and keep trying. And if you meet with someone who is crappy, fire them and like move on, because like when you know, when it's a good fit, it's a good fit. And it's like some of the best, I think it's like one of the best relationships people can have in their lives, actually, if possible. So let me, do you have anything to say, anything else to say on that? I don't want to cut you off.
No, we're good.
I'm like, oh, you do have more to say. You're holding back.
I always have
a little side eye and like, oh yeah, we're good, we're fine. I'm like, you can say more about it.
No, I mean, I think it's also has to do with our education system within higher education too. And like I'm taking our one like multicultural class like this summer, and it's been awful. And like the lack of like information, and where it's like I don't feel like after going through the class, like I don't feel like I would be prepared to work with minorities in general if I was not one and had not been intentional about learning and reading and being invested in this community. But also it's like they try to do like stuff like worldwide, and I'm like, we have like 7 weeks, like we can't talk about the entire world, and we shouldn't, because we're not even prepared to work within the people within our communities. And so yeah, I think education is like super important as well, and like it falls upon the counselor in order to do their extra research, because in general the system is failing us. Yeah. And so I feel like there's always a balance between like your individual striving to do better and then also creating systemic change and fighting for the education system to actually change.
I was just listening to something yesterday, and the therapist was saying that the job of a therapist is literally to like tear down and debunk systems of oppression. Mm-hmm. And I think there are so many, unfortunately, I mean, I think that there is a lot of good happening in the world, but there's a lot of different systems of oppression as well. And I just think that like in trying to actually engage with the ones that you're like face to face with and doing that well, and then doing the next thing, you know, because I don't know what your experience. I think that a lot of my clients, I hear them saying like, man, I feel really tired and overwhelmed with just like culture, loosely and stuff like that. And they like come from different, like some of them are Black, some of them are brown, some of them are white, some of them are Asian, you know, there's like a variety of people, but just like feeling really kind of like worn out and hopeless, I think, in a lot of the ability to change and the ability to engage things. And then like to hear kind of within the academic system, it's kind of like, this 7-week course is not cutting it. Like come on, like let's like revamp it in a way, or actually make it to where it's like doing some good and not just like checking a box for accreditation and licensure in your institution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my thoughts about that. No, what you were saying about people being tired and feeling hopeless, like I 100% resonate with. I feel that a lot at different times, but the thing I think that's been most helpful for me is the concept of hope being built through action.
Ooh, I love that.
Actually like engaging and doing things that fit within your wheelhouse. And so I keep seeing all of these things on social media about like people going to all these protests or doing all of this organizing or like making all of these posts or making live videos, which I'm not the best at. I can do interviews much better than I can do live videos. But yeah, I was like, I'm starting to feel inadequate. Like I can't do any of these things. I don't even know how I'm going to create change, blah, blah, blah. And then like realizing that like I still have things that are beneficial, and I can create action in the little things that I can do. And so whether that is the videos that I was sharing from Healthyhood, and so I reshared some of them with like a twist to talk more about what was currently happening with the Black Lives Matter movement, and the things that were happening with that, and like the mental health realities that come up as a part of that. And or like I in the last like 2 to 3 years have made it a very intentional shift to buying more Black owned products. And so within my like bathroom, I can find like 5 to 6 different products that I can like share with you people and be like, oh look, if this is something that you're interested in doing, like let me give you a recommendation that I've personally tried this and I really enjoy it. Or I go to a different Black owned restaurant at least once a month, and so let me share the ones that I've been to. And like the interaction that I've had with people over it, the people who've been like, oh yeah, like I went and picked up food from here now, and like stuff like that has been like helping me to build hope that there's change happening. And like most of those people were white, and like that's great. Like that's 100% what we need to be happening, because the disparity of Black-owned businesses, Black-owned practices, Black-owned nonprofits, and the access and the exposure that they get is devastating. And so the fact that I can do a little part to like support a business in my community it helps me to feel more hopeful.
Yeah, and I love, Shalom, what you were saying, even just thinking about art and expression around like small things that fit within your life. even like your videos, because you love like educating people and like providing resources and stuff. And I just think that like creativity is like one of the most important fuels for life. And I think our culture, unfortunately, really like snuffs it out with like being super busy and like technology, which I'm like guilty of as well. But it's just kind of it like a lack of margin, I think, has really made no space in people's lives to be creative. So I'm finding that like people no longer are actually really even knowing what's their like thing. And I just think that like generally as a culture, we need to just become more human, like beings, that whole like being versus doing, to really just like allow some margin, to allow some healing, that will allow for some creativity that will like be action that's really impactful.
Yeah.
And creativity, I mean, you're an art therapist. That's how I made that connection. Yeah. Art therapist to creativity. That was a little bit wayward, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, like the amount of people who I'll be like, oh, you should like make art, that'll help you process it. And they'll be like, oh, I'm not creative.
No, everybody is. Everybody is.
That's like not a real thing. And
Yeah.
like the way that I've explained it in the past is like everyone is creative within their own field. So even if you're a basketball player, you can be creative in the way that you do that. You can be creative in the way that you cook, in the way that you do math. Like, I don't really know math that well, but the higher up you get, the more that you realize that you're just making stuff up and seeing if it works.
I was gonna say, the type of math I do is definitely not creative, because it's like rules bound. It's addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and it's nothing else. So I can't really be creative with math.
But the higher level mathematicians
can
be creative.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's everywhere. We just don't think about it that way. We think that art is only within fine arts, and that's like completely not true.
Yeah. I even think sometimes just like the way you dress, the way you do your hair, the way you walk, and some of that may have to do with like esteem issues and stuff like that. Like our self-esteem, I think, impacts some of that, but it's just kind of like how you show up in the world is your own creative space. So it doesn't have to be this kind of like you're saying, fine art, this like grand and really small world, a small world. So.
And even with someone who's like loved art their entire life, like I've had such a hard time calling myself an artist. Like, because I don't paint and because I don't draw, that's the first thing that people say. They're like, oh, draw something for me. And I'm like, it's going to be just as ugly as your drawing because I don't draw. Like, like my first day at work, working at Breakthrough, we had like an all staff meeting. So there was like 60 people in the room, and it was I think it was my first week, maybe second day. And the executive director stands up and she goes, we're going to talk about something about like atoms or something like that. And they're like, Shalom, you're the arts and tech draw. Can you draw an atom for us? And like, thankfully I knew what it was, but I was like, no, I don't know how to draw.
That's terrible. Let me show you my attempt. Oh, there, right here. My attempt at watercolor painting.
Yes.
The other day, we have this bad boy, which is Color Explosion, and we have the killer hornets from somewhere. I don't know where they're from. There you go. I tried a little bit of art. I'm never good at painting in my life, but there they are.
Yes. So, well, this is actually one of my pots. So that's like it's a bowl that I made that I turned into a planter. So you can see.
Oh, I would love to see it.
There. And then this actually is my first attempt at paper mache. So I have little bits and pieces of art around me, but I also thought maybe I could share some of my art therapy directives.
Yes, please. Yeah.
So I have two thoughts in my head. Yep. So I was having a conversation with a friend about self-soothing and about how like in the midst of everything going on, there's like a lot of different ways that you can approach that. And so there's like in my mind, there's two different kinds of art. There's like art that helps you process things, and then there's art that's mindless and helps you just keep your hands busy while your mind does whatever it needs to do. And so the first one that I'm going to talk about is called Zentangles, where it's literally just tiny little doodles. So when you do it on a smaller scale, it feels like way more manageable. Like, because you're just doing something and it's really repetitive. So like, all you do is like take a small piece of paper and then you make a small square and then you just make 3 random lines. So like you can see my line was like right here. Yep. And then I have a line going right there. I think, oh, maybe it's 2 for 3 separate sections. Yeah. And then you just make a repetitive section over and over and over. And it's like a meditative practice through drawing.
Yeah.
And so within doing that, I have a couple reflection questions after you do it. Yeah. So the first one is, what do you find your mind wandering to while you work on it?
Yeah.
The second is, how often in your week do you focus on output or creation instead of input in consuming things? And then the last one is, reflect on the difference between creating and consuming in your life and how it feels. And so, yeah, for me, just the process of creating something, and that, like, my grandma sent me some quilt blocks that she couldn't finish because she couldn't see. And so that's been something that's really helped me the last 2 weeks, is like just mindlessly following the pattern that was already laid out for me and just like not having to think or process. So yes, so that's one kind of art, and you don't need any art skills in order to do that. And then the second one is a directive called layered emotions. And so you take any kind of paper would work. The ideal is like wax paper or like transparency paper, but you could also do it with printer paper if that's all you have. But you're creating on it different emotions and displaying them through the colors and the shapes and the lines. And so each different slide you create is a different emotion. And then once you finish them, you can put them all together and see how they all interact. And so like for me, I can't remember all of what these were because I didn't label them, sadly, and I made it like a year and a half ago. But like this one for me was anger. And like for me, anger is always hidden. Like it's always hidden by something else. So it usually comes out as sadness instead of anger. And so when I put it all the way at the back, it's like, yep, looking at me, you can't see it at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it is still there. And so I think with coronavirus, with police brutality, with all of these different things that are happening all on top of each other, there is so many emotions. And it's so hard to be like, this is how I feel in one word, because there's so many things that you're feeling. And so taking the time to actually like label them and draw them and to actually like translate that for yourself. And then the reflection questions for that are, number 1, which feeling is the most noticeable? 2, which feeling did you place on top? 3, which one did you put on the bottom? What feelings are hidden? What feelings are most visible towards the edge? And then how do you see the feelings interacting with each other? So yeah, so like for me, there was some different times that I noticed different things where I was like, oh, I feel like lonely, but like my happiness was like connecting the times when I felt lonely and the people around me that like felt far away. And so realizing how much like connection with other people actually does tie into my happiness. And so different things like that, where it's like, you kind of know it, but it's interesting how like your visual representation can actually like affirm things that you didn't know would show up when you were making it.
I mean, our brain literally thinks in pictures and colors. Like, how can we just slap a word on it when actually it's something that like doesn't exactly resonate with like our emotional processing system. I also just really love that. I know, like, gosh, I know we're like, that time flew by the way. I love that. That time flew by. But I love that, like, for both the things you shared, you also almost have like an embodiment of like what you were feeling, thinking at that like moment in time. But like, you're like, I did this a year and a half ago and I don't quite remember, but I do remember that this is anger, you know, and then to see like how that is like sometimes like the same or different now, but it's almost kind of like those get stored, I think, in those actual objects in a way.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I said a lot, especially when I talked about the poem that I wrote after my student died. that for me was like, my emotion was literally in that piece of paper. Like, and so every single time I would read it for almost 3 years, I would start crying. Like, and it wasn't like, it was like really up, like my emotions are like, sometimes they're really close to the surface and then sometimes they're not. And it didn't matter how far below that they were, I would cry. Like, because it very much was like, it brought back everything I was feeling during that time. And it lessened it when I first wrote it, was like, it didn't feel like it was always at the top anymore because I had actually processed through it. One of the things that my dad always says, I'm not sure where he got it from, but is that thoughts untangle themselves through the lips or through the fingertips.
Oh, I gotta write that down. The thoughts entangle themselves through the lips or through the fingertips.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so helping you understand how you feel or what you think, either by talking or by writing or creating. And that has been very true in my life.
Yeah. No, that's honestly, I am so glad that you were on here talking about this today. I think it's so powerful. I think we really do need to come at being well in a holistic sense. And I don't think that we can be whole if we just like fragment different like parts of our body or parts of our being. And I think I'm just really thankful for your approach, because it does kind of interweave these different parts about being human in a way that like is not, I mean, beautiful. I say it in a very vague general term, because I know that like sometimes emotions and the way we express them are not beautiful per se, but they actually are in my opinion. So I'm just like really appreciating just everything you kind of said about being people, engaging in the world, using art, using just like even community and like action, all this different stuff. I just really, it's the reason why I wanted to have you on here chatting, you know. And let's do this. Let's how can people get like follow you, and especially when this like amazing nonprofit comes to be, how can people just like, I don't know if you're open to people engaging on this, but how can people follow you and get a hold of you that suits you best?
So Instagram is probably the easiest. So my Instagram handle is @Shalomi _the_homie.
We'll tag it. We're gonna tag it for the
And then also like I saved some of the art directives in my stories, and they're linked to Healthy Hood's Instagram, and so they're like IG Live or IGTV, whatever you call it, has those saved. So there's like 9 of them too. So if you're interested in more art directives, they're always there. And then I also have a ceramics page too. So that's also, you can also find that on my page too. But
okay, perfect. So the main thing is your Instagram, which we'll put in on this connected to it. Any last final thoughts and reflections or comments?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay, I'm glad you're good.
All of my thoughts.
It's nice, honestly, just to like officially meet you, you know. And I'm sure, honestly, I'm just like really excited for our paths to continue to like cross, because I think that there's a lot of good that can come just from people like connecting, and like you do art therapy that I don't do, as like in the like maybe I use expressive modality. It's just like, I think we need each other is what I'm trying to say. I think we need each other. So all right, Shalom, have a good day. We'll talk soon.